Disney's Atlantis film is considered one of the most underrated movies in their entire collection, and I personally find that the real-life Atlantis mythology is some of the least understood in the world. So today, I want to talk about the movie, its history, and the crazy real-life mythology that inspired it. So try to stick around till the end on this one, because you'll probably find yourself learning that there's a lot more truth to this tale than you previously thought, or at least more evidence if you were already a big believer. The Disney Atlantis film followed the story of Milo in the year 1918 as he leads an expedition underwater to try and find the lost city of Atlantis, the supposed ancient civilization in the Atlantic Ocean that sank beneath the floodwaters according to Greek myth. The real-life story of Atlantis was something easily forgotten in pop culture in my opinion, and until this film, a lot of kids like myself had never even heard of Atlantis. Its main character Milo wasn't the rugged captain of the team either, but instead, Milo was the young geeky guy who had an interest in what everyone else called just a myth, but who, because of his deep knowledge on the subject, had to lead the expedition in order to prove it was true. He was the perfect character for geeky children to proxy into, inspiring a lot of kids like myself to just dig even deeper into the book collections on ghosts, aliens, and Atlantis to try and find something that one day you could prove was true. It convinced you that you could round up a diverse team of friends with really niche interests and skills, and together you could prove something magical to the world. I'd honestly say it's a large part of why I'm working on this channel today, where I mostly talk about cartoons and their crazy real-life mythological inspirations. The movie didn't just have Milo and a cool gang of experts discovering the ruins of the city either, but instead, when they arrive, they find the remnants of the dying Atlantean civilization with people that managed to survive in an underground cavern. With the help of the Atlantean princess Kida, Milo learns that the Atlanteans survived underwater with the help of a large crystal containing the spirits of their ancestors. When threatened, this crystal took Kida's mother as a sort of sacrifice or vessel to act through, and created a protective dome around Atlantis to stop the Great Flood from wiping out all of its people. Since then, the crystal has provided power for their lights and something of an atmosphere, but by the dim-looking sky, you can tell that its power is fading, and that the people are coming close to the end of their resources. Milo's team is revealed to be trying to sell the crystal for profit, and after it merges with Kida, Milo and the gang work together to save her and restore the power of Atlantis. It was a fun and adventurous film that critics have very little to say against, with a few complaints I do hear generally being about the accuracy of the film to the legend. So let's talk about that and unravel the real-life conspiracy surrounding this supposed myth. The story of Atlantis wasn't something found in the oral tradition of Greek mythology, which would later be written in the 8th century BC by writers like Hesiod and Homer. Instead, the story of Atlantis was written by the Greek philosopher Plato closer to the 4th century before Christ, with Plato claiming that it was a mythological or historical tale that Greece had lost entirely and that had been passed down to Plato from Egypt. The Disney film references Plato several times, including its opening quote that states Atlantis sank in a single day and night, an idea that comes directly from Plato's account. According to Plato, Atlantis was a nation ruled over by semi-divine kings, descendants of the god Poseidon. And for a time, Atlantis was said to thrive as a powerful and prosperous society under these rulers. Eventually, however, the Atlantean kings began to intermix with humans, and as their divine nature diminished, they became more sinful and corrupt. This led to them oppressing the lower classes and neighboring peoples, which caused Poseidon's brother Zeus to send a great flood to destroy Atlantis entirely. While a small group of Atlanteans were said to survive by boat and try to reclaim Greece, they were said to be defeated by the Athenians, making them heroes to the rest of the world, particularly Egypt. Now, the story of Atlantis is ultimately the story of the struggle between Zeus and Poseidon, or more specifically, Poseidon's descendants. While some of Plato's students dismissed it as a fable, it reflects a much older and widespread mythological theme, the rivalry between the thunder god and the ocean god. In the Greek pantheon, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades are three principal gods who divided the world into three territories for each of them to rule. Zeus, the god of thunder, rules the sky and all of the land beneath it. Poseidon, the god of the sea, governs the ocean and all of its waters. Finally, Hades, the god of the underworld, presides over the realm of the dead. This triad of gods can be found in other ancient cultures. Most people know that in Rome, for instance, the thunder god Zeus is known as Jupiter. His brother Poseidon is known as Neptune, and their other brother Hades is known as Pluto, each maintaining the same role of thunder, sea, and underworld. To the east, in the land of Canaan, we have the thunder god Baal, who is a pretty perfect parallel to Zeus. Baal has a brother who, like Poseidon, is the god of the sea, here known as Yam. And of course, these two have a third brother, the god of the underworld, known here as Mot instead of Hades. The most important text involving these gods is called the Baal cycle, in which Baal first has to go against the god of the sea, who claims to rule the entire world, and then after defeating him, later has to go on to fight the god of the underworld. Basically, Zeus fighting Poseidon, and then Zeus fighting Hades. The Battle of Baal against Yam mirrors the story of Zeus punishing Atlantis, where Zeus asserts his authority over Poseidon's descendants by sending a flood to destroy them. The Disney film, interestingly, seems to encourage us to connect these stories with its reference to the sea monster Leviathan. In the movie, Leviathan is a giant robotic sea monster created by the Atlanteans to protect their island, even after it was submerged. As Milo explains, however, Leviathan is a sea monster mentioned in the Jewish Old Testament, with no writings directly connecting Leviathan to Atlantis. In the Jewish tradition, which grew out or alongside the Canaanites in the Levant, Leviathan is an ancient sea monster so massive and powerful that God had to destroy its mate to prevent it from reproducing and destroying the world. In the Baal cycle, however, Baal, who we associate with Zeus, also battles and defeats a sea monster that serves Yam, the god of the sea like Poseidon. This sea monster was even called Lotan, which was the root for the word Leviathan in the Old Testament, meaning that as far as comparative mythology goes, the idea that Leviathan is associated with Atlantis and something of a protector to it is actually somewhat accurate. And there are more instances where the Disney film wants us to connect these cultures and even others. Particularly when Milo brings up the biblical Tower of Babel to describe why Kida can understand each of his crew's different languages, from French to English, despite Kida having lived underground for 8,000 years without contact with these different cultures that wouldn't develop until some time after Atlantis had already sunk. Milo suggests in the film that the Atlantean language is a well-preserved root language, dating back to the biblical Tower of Babel from the Book of Genesis. According to the Tower of Babel narrative, Noah's descendants, after surviving a great flood, all spoke one language and shared one culture. Together, they built a tower to reach the heavens, but it was seen as a vain attempt to elevate themselves to the status of gods. In response, the Old Testament God destroys the tower, scattering the people across the earth and dividing them by giving them different languages. All languages that were supposed to share an origin before the Tower of Babel and the Great Flood. The idea in the film is that Kida's language predates these divisions, making it the ancestor of all the existing human languages today. With just a few words from new languages like French or English then, Kida can quickly recognize which of the root words of her language are relevant to those people, allowing her to quickly learn pretty much any language. The 70 descendants of Noah as listed in biblical tradition include ancestors claimed by both the Greeks and the Canaanites, suggesting that their myths of floods and wars may stem from shared ancient events, possibly tied to Atlantis itself. And other cultures branching from Noah's lineage, such as the Babylonians, do have similar myths as well. For instance, in the Babylonian mythology, the patron god Marduk has to slay sea monsters before later defeating the saltwater goddess Tiamat, allowing humanity to safely establish itself afterwards. Once again, giving us another mythological tale about an ocean-themed god going to war with people of the mainland. So the question from here becomes, why does the story of Atlantis seem to be missing from the earlier Greek mythology? Well, after closer examination with the myths of these other cultures, we can go back to the original Greek mythology and find that it's actually not quite missing, they just use different symbols. In Plato's account of Atlantis, the story is of Poseidon's descendants, with his eldest son and ruler of Atlantis being the god Atlas. However, before Zeus worship came in from the east and north, the people who lived in Greece, particularly along the coast, were known to worship the god Poseidon. And with the Greeks being caught sort of in the middle between the eastern thunder worship and the western ocean worship, it makes sense that they would replace him as a villain in greater Greek mythology. In the original myth, Atlas is not the son of Poseidon, but is instead descended from the Titan Oceanus, with Atlas being described as fighting on the side of the Titans as well as some of his other brothers, also descended from the Oceanus Titan. Following this battle, the Titans were banished to Tartarus, the deepest of hells, with Atlas being given the punishment of holding up the sky from the Atlas Mountains, real mountains in Africa near the Straits of Gibraltar, with Plato claiming in his writings that Atlantis existed just beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean. The Greeks see themselves as descended from the god Prometheus, who is the brother of Atlas and likewise is the grandson of Oceanus. Thus, you can probably see now that the ancient Greeks with their Poseidon worship didn't want to villainize his character in their mythologies, and instead they created the more primordial ancient sea god Oceanus to take on that villainous role for him, with the Greeks still seeing themselves as descended from that ocean god. Plato wasn't the only one to try and reinterpret ancient myths with their battles of gods and monsters into a story that more closely reflects real-life history, with it being a battle between different people groups. In Judaism, we of course have the story of the flood from the book of Genesis, but in the centuries before the life of Christ, another text would emerge called the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is a retelling of the flood story, blending with it key elements and themes from the Garden of Eden narrative. This text introduces the concept of the fallen angels known as Watchers, referred to in the Bible as the sons of God, divine beings who were sent down to earth in order to help guide humanity to prosperous civilizations. These angels, however, decided they would instead take human wives who would then give birth to giant semi-divine children, with these half-human children said to become increasingly corrupt with each generation. This mirrors the story of Atlantis, where the sons of God are known as the sons of the god Poseidon, who himself had a child with a human woman named Cleo, and whose own children continued to marry into human lines. Both stories also share a similar resolution, the corruption of these divine human hybrids provoking the chief god to destroy the civilizations with a flood. In Atlantis, Zeus punishes Poseidon's descendants, and in the Book of Enoch, God drowns the world to erase the wickedness of the Watcher's offspring. These parallels are striking, especially since Plato's works are said to be over 100 years older than the Book of Enoch. The writings of Atlantis and the Book of Enoch both serve as later metaphorical additions to their earlier traditions. They each reinterpret gods, symbols, and legendary figures from earlier myth, and reimagine them as tribes of divine beings in order to more accurately show the conflicts between humans. That means, despite being later traditions, they actually are more faithful to the original stories, even if only by attempts of reconstruction, allowing their respective cultures to more accurately preserve their earlier mythology and their lost history. Now, for those who want to believe in Atlantis at this point, the question becomes, where is the physical evidence? There are many books written over the decades compiling different scientific evidence for the existence of Atlantis, with my favorite being Atlantis, Mother of Empires by Robert Stacey Judd. Robert Stacey Judd was known for leading expeditions into the Mesoamericas in order to examine the different architecture found there, such as with the Mayan pyramids. He believed that these and other cultures such as those in Europe had evidence of being from the same root culture, perhaps Atlantis, and a lot of his book actually focuses on trying to prove that with science more so than with mythology. When looking at a map of the oceans, for instance, you can see that the seafloor has different elevation at different points, with Atlantis enthusiasts wanting to believe that the shallow seafloor in the Atlantic is evidence that it was once above the ocean itself. He also examines cooled lava samples that were found in the region. The formation of this cooled lava is supposed to indicate that it actually cooled above the surface of the ocean instead of beneath it, providing the possibility that the landmass itself was once above the ocean. He also claims that certain coral masses found in the Atlantic Ocean seem to have originally grown when there was more sunlight available, hinting at the idea that these areas as well were closer to the surface. Since Judd's time publishing in 1939, genetic studies have emerged that some interpret as evidence of a shared origin between Europeans and populations in the Americas, possibly linked to the Atlanteans. This comes from the DNA marker haplogroup X, which is found in ancient Native American populations as well as parts of Europe, but not something found as much in Asia, where the Native Americans are said to have originally migrated from. Some studies even indicate that major migrations of this DNA marker would have happened 28,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago, aligning with the theories of the timeline of Atlantis, particularly its final sinking. The theory is essentially that when Atlantis sank, different boats would go in different directions, some to the Americas and some to Europe. This makes sense when you consider that in Greek mythology, the descendants of the Oceanic Titan were said to have different territories in Europe, starting with Atlas and the Atlas Mountains, and continuing all the way to Greece with Prometheus. It could also reflect Mesoamerican myths, where they too are visited by a divine being known as Quetzalcoatl, who is said to use his blood and the bones of humans to recreate the human species after a great flood destroyed the old world, with other similar examples existing throughout the different cultures in the Americas. Now, of course, after watching the Atlantis movie, a question a lot of fans have is whether or not the Atlanteans surviving underground is based on any real esoteric history. And there are myths all over the world of there being ancient civilizations that exist underground. The Aztecs, for instance, have some mythology involving them coming from an underground world called the Place of Seven Caves, a place filled with advanced underground tribes that would one day emerge to populate the surface world, with the people who stayed behind being known to still retain great wisdom. All the way over in India, they had the story of the Naga, serpent-like beings who inhabit a vast underground world called the Patala. None of these myths really prove Atlanteans survived after the Great Flood, especially below the ground. But for those who have an interest, it's definitely an interesting rabbit hole to explore. An important part of the Disney movie's lore is the magical crystal that floats above Atlantis in ancient times, and is hidden below Atlantis when Milo and his team arrive. This crystal is explained to be the souls and memories of the Atlantean people, combined together to create a powerful energy source that can also perform great miracles. In order to perform these miracles, however, it requires a human vessel that is righteous in nature and royal in blood. In the past, Kita's father, the Atlantean king, tried to use the power of the crystal as a weapon, but this led to a flood so great it was going to destroy Atlantis entirely and topple the rest of the world's civilizations. To prevent this, Kita's mother was chosen as a vessel by the crystal to create an underwater dome that protected Atlantis for the next 8,000 years. But after so much time, the crystal's powers were dying. After being attached to the crystal for too long, Kita's mother became unsavable, which is a common fate for those who are chosen by the crystal as a vessel. Kita, on the other hand, was rescued in time by the end of the film and freed from the crystal's power. The crystal acts as something of a hive mind, and because of this, it requires something more human to direct its energy into a specific goal. Over time, however, the human directing the crystal joins the hive mind and becomes another soul fueling it. The crystal itself is a physical manifestation of the world's most ancient religion, the belief that spiritual ancestors could protect us and guide us. On the small scale, this practice began in the most ancient times of human history and still persists to this day. It involves simply praying to family members who have passed away, whether they were known to you in life or lived long before you were born. As tribes grew, merged, and assimilated, these family spirits were often merged into one chief god, whose story represented the broader history of the people who worshipped him, with individual families still maintaining the reverence and worship of their own patriarchs as family spirits within this bigger system. This practice led to the formation of the first major societies in history, such as Egypt. In Egypt, this family spirit practice evolved into a cultural-wide system with the god Osiris. Osiris was once the god of Egypt and the supreme ruler of the world, but was killed by the thunder god Set, an equivalent to Baal or Zeus, mirroring the story in the Baal cycle where Baal has to defeat Yam, the ocean god, and then later defeat Ma'at, the god of the underworld. In the Egyptian story, Osiris was revived by his wife long enough to impregnate her, resulting in the birth of the god Horus, who later defeats Set and reclaims Egypt. Osiris experienced a spiritual resurrection in the afterlife, becoming the god of the underworld. The belief of the Egyptians was that their elites initiated into the system, particularly the pharaohs, could spiritually ascend to join Osiris in the afterlife, becoming one with him and ruling over the underworld while guiding the people left behind on Earth. This was an elitist, restricted ancestor ritual in which the initiate acted out the story of Osiris's death and resurrection, believing it prepared them to unite with Osiris in the afterlife as a spirit. Even the monotheistic Judaism has this concept, with Jewish people praying to their ancestor Enoch, who is said to ascend and become an angel guiding the Jewish people. The Atlantean crystal represents this real-life concept, relying on the sacrifice of royals to wield its power beyond just being an energy source. And to emphasize the crystal as a force of love rather than harm, Kita returns from the crystal holding her childhood bracelet, the one Kita's mother accidentally took with her into the crystal 8,000 years ago. Finally, the last thing I want to address is something I often call the Saturn secret, but whose title doesn't quite fit here today. I'm of course referring to the scenes where the Atlantean crystal begins to power up and it begins to spin so fast that it resembles the planet Saturn. Even before the spinning intensifies, the crystal still lightly mirrors this imagery with the floating mask of the previous Atlantean kings that encircle it. This circle with a dot, sometimes seen as a circle with two lines, has an interesting yet hard to entirely grasp esoteric history. But for films like Disney's Atlantis, it has become a sort of secret initiation code meant to show other people who have made it that far down the rabbit hole that the writers have been there too. This circle with a dot is a symbol that dates back to ancient Egypt, where it was said to represent none other than the sun itself, often the most powerful god in different pantheons. After discovering that the real-life planet Saturn had rings about it just a few centuries ago, however, esoteric conspiracy theorists are believed to have constructed the theory that deep in the past, Saturn was much closer to the Earth, and in fact was centered above our polar north, which some esoteric conspiracy theorists want to say was Atlantis at that time. This rather wild belief seemed to stem from the fact that in so many ancient cultures, when the sun isn't the primary god of worship, it is Saturn himself, with Saturn in the Roman, or Kronos in the Greek, being seen as ruling over the Golden Age deep in the past, the same Golden Age we associate with the rule of the Titans, with Kronos or Saturn being their leader. In the supposed Saturn theory, the planet of Saturn itself was supposed to have somehow detached itself from its closeness to the Earth, becoming the most distant visible planet from us, along the way causing significant disasters like the Great Flood that knocked over the civilizations of the world and buried Atlantis beneath the ocean. I call this the supposed Saturn theory because I can't find an overt claim from any secret society saying this is what they actually believe, even if it's something they hint at. While some esoteric writers like Madame Blavatsky and Manly P. Hall do allude to this in their different works, it was later writers like Talbot from the 1980s who dissected the works and some secret society symbolism to try and give a more cohesive picture of what they are implied to believe. And people do have other theories for this Saturn-looking shape in ancient mythology. A lot of these myths depict God as being at the top of a mountain at the center of the world. And we see that visually at the end of the Atlantis film when the crystal is returned to the top of the pyramid at the center of the city. Something I wouldn't have noticed without the help of my editor Haro. This O&A symbolism can also be seen in quite a few of the posters for the movie, and the title itself also seems to allude to this. In the logo presented at the beginning of the film, we see the name Atlantis with the A stylized to look something like a mountain. But in the original Atlantean language made for the film that this title transitions from, it is just a spiraling circle with a dot at the center, visually representing not just that idea of Saturn, but the crystal with the spinning masks around it. The Saturn theory is generally the most difficult thing for me to explain in Esoterica, and it's something I've only ever discussed on this channel one time in my breakdown for the indie web series Murder Drones. As crazy and unrelated as it may seem, this Saturn symbol has become a connecting image between the many esoteric movies and shows, from children's cartoons like The Owl House on Disney, to Brad Pitt-produced streaming series like The OA and The Outer Range. As tangential as it may seem to the Disney Atlantis film, it's become something of a secret symbol for people who have gone this far down in the rabbit hole to be able to recognize each other in media. Not telling you that this is what they believe, or even if they believe some version of it, but instead leaving it behind just as a sign to let others who get that deep in the rabbit hole know that they aren't the first ones to get there and that they aren't alone. And at the end of the day, that is what the spirit of the Atlantis movie is. It's about the nerds who dig a little deeper into these ancient stories than everyone else, who seems to dismiss them as just a myth. And for those who believe they were more than just stories, they are often happy to find that there is much more to the narratives than people know about. Details that take them from just a myth to a possible historical reality. I hate to say that any piece of media is a love letter, but the film truly is a love letter to those who do their research, containing connections that even people pretty far down in the rabbit hole may not necessarily notice and can still be surprised by. For those who made it this far, let me know by putting 3 exclamation points in your comments down below, and I'll be sure to thank you personally. Not as many people tend to watch my pet project videos like these that aren't based on some recent release like our Hell of a Boss videos or our Digital Circus videos. But if you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person these videos are made for. Let me know what other esoteric deep dives you think I should tackle next in the comments down below, and if you want to support me with my pet projects like this video where I try to explain real-life mythology using cartoons, consider signing up for our YouTube membership program. This video was available there for an entire day before it was released publicly, and we're currently working on other projects, including explaining world mythology using the Hercules movie, and explaining the hidden story of Lucifer in the Bible using Has-Been Hotel. So sign up so you can help us make those videos a reality. And see you guys next time.